And so I see curiosity as fundamentally relational. So it's not just information, it's not the propositional knowledge, it's not just facts. People think that if I just consume the right facts, I'll be able to make the right decisions. And that only works if you're able to fully metabolize them and have
Yeah.
them change you and wrestle with them and see, why are they right? Why are they wrong? In what context does this apply? In what context does it not apply? And so I think that's the root of curiosity that excites me.
Welcome to another episode of the Cartoon Network Show. Today's episode, we're going to explore a topic that lies at the intersection of modern life and timeless wisdom: nurturing adult curiosity and embracing unstructured learning. The question we're trying to answer is, how can we sustain curiosity and independent thinking in a world driven by algorithms? Our guest today is Andrew Connor, the co-founder of Levels. Levels is a company that helps you understand how food impacts your health using data from biosensors like continuous glucose monitors. He's a deep thinker who embodies thoughtful exploration. But today we're not going to talk about health. We're not going to talk about startups. We're going to examine the mental frameworks and habits that sustain lifelong curiosity. Andrew shares insights from his recent 18-month sabbatical. We discuss strategies for maintaining intellectual playfulness in an algorithm-driven world. We talk about why wisdom is the best predictor of life satisfaction. And we cover practical tactics to cultivate your information diet. These concepts often work together. Curiosity fuels exploration, which then builds your cognitive ability, the mental capacity to reason and solve problems. This cognitive growth supports independent thinking, the ability to form your own judgment and opinions. And over time, these combined elements cultivate wisdom. So enjoy this episode as we explored curiosity, cognitive growth, and why learning to wrestle with your own ideas can be your most valuable asset. I've followed a lot of your work and a lot of your writing. I would definitely say that I try to get my essays to the level that you write, which I would describe as really interesting ideas. Very counterintuitive, but makes you think. Whether people agree or not when they're reading your essays, I do think it makes you pause and think. And I think that is probably a good sign of a well-written essay, but huge fan. I want to start off and ask you about your sabbatical and what you've been up to, and just give a little context for people. I guess you left Levels, I think, in July or about 18
Towards
months
the
ago.
beginning of last year. So yeah, around February.
Yeah. So what have you been up to since you started your sabbatical?
Yeah. It was the right time for me to take a step back from Levels. And I had never taken any kind of serious step away from economic pursuits. It was always building something or career advancement or something like that. And so I set minimum 6 months. I try to do nothing that makes any kind of money. And so like I try to explicitly set the litmus test of seek playfulness, curiosity, that kind of thing, but it cannot be a business. Like it cannot be like the next big thing or something like that. And so I threw myself into artistic pottery. There's a
Wow.
studio near me and was doing probably about 15, 16 hours in the studio a week building pieces. And it was wonderful because my entire career had been very cerebral and like
Yeah.
principles and algorithms and frameworks and that kind of thing. And clay is a wonderful medium because the learning curve is just so pleasant. Like someone who like starts on a wheel is basically incompetent, but within an hour or so can do very basic shapes. But then that learning curve continues for years and years and years, where you get more refined and more pulling out the differences in different kinds of clay and that kind of thing. So it was a wonderful exploration into unusual form and shape and this artistic expression that I had never been able to do. And so that was one of my top priorities, spending time outside. I live in a rural Colorado town that gives me access to mountains. Like there's a mountain right out my window
Oh,
that
amazing.
way. And yeah, just appreciating nature, appreciating movement, like really pushing myself both in like a Goggins way and like a just enjoyment kind of way. And so that was wonderful. And then also wrestled with a lot of ideas. And so I had kind of like created landing pads for ideas that I was attracted to in the years prior. And so just dove into each of them. So a lot of my essays are actually from a particular one of those that was just this nice little resting pad where I could just put references to these ideas and they kind of just grow over time.
How hard was it for you to not think about business ideas during that time? Or did you find it really easy to turn that part of your brain off?
There's actually two questions there. How hard was it to
Yeah.
turn that part of the brain off? So I remember compulsively checking email for like 3 or 4 weeks after I left Levels full time. And I did not have responsibilities. I was available
Yeah.
for a lot of handoff sort of stuff. But I remember just like I would wake up in the morning and first thing I would do is check email or something like that. And for no reason. Breaking that mental pattern took a while. And then I think creating the commitment of not trying to pursue anything business related was nice because I make that decision one time. It felt good. And so I don't have to be productive. And I think
Yeah.
that was something that was important to me is leave room for no productivity and then create ahead of time the guardrails that I wanted to exist to catch myself if I fell. So like an example was no Netflix, no sleeping in, reading at least a book a week, that kind of thing where it was like things that like, okay, if I'm just languishing and now I'm just unemployed, then okay, things aren't going well. And, I need to like, change things up a bit. But as long as I feel drawn towards something, even if that something keeps changing, then things are going well and to just stay the
Yeah.
course.
I like those guardrails. Tend to go towards the extremes when I'm trying something new.
Mm.
So I went working really hard to doing the complete opposite. And I think most people will want to land somewhere in the middle. A lot of those guardrails that you mentioned, I've started to do, and it makes the days feel a lot more productive with some type of purpose of getting things done.
I had this idea of myself that I had this high energy of this high pressure hose that was just like, shooting
Yeah.
out or something like that. And I wanted to understand my relationship with that phenomenon that like when I'm on, I'm 100% on. And when I'm not, it's that other extreme. And I didn't want to turn the water off, but I wanted to really sit there and understand the phenomenon and
Mm.
even just let it run for a little bit. See what is the thing that part of me is wanting to do. And that ended up being really nice. I think someone I've talked with recently calls this clarity of desire that like under all of this is this like underlying theme, but the high pressure hose can get in the way a little bit. And so sometimes you just have to let it run and see what it wants to say.
So you originally wanted to do it for 6 months. It turned into 18 months. So, first question is what changed your thought process from 6 months to 18 months? Why did it extend much longer than you anticipated?
Yeah, I think the 6 months was no economic pursuits in any way
Got it.
for 6 months. And then just see what emerges from there. And a few things happened. So towards the end of last year, I started playing around with an idea that I probably would have solo founded slash bootstrapped and would probably take me probably a year and a half to build like, a software product, but didn't need a very large team. I didn't need to fundraise. Like it was, very valuable kind of software. And I gave that one a 3-minute bucket of like, okay, am I as jazzed about this after working on it for a while? And I actually couldn't get to the conviction that I wanted,
Yeah.
either myself or the idea or something like that. So I have a few tens of thousands of lines of code written that maybe one day I'll use for something. In that process, I started writing a book, which consumed probably 3 or 4 months. And I'm about 200 good pages in. And I imagine it's going to be around 300, but I'll need to hit 400 and cut it back down. And the book is on portfolio management for tech people, basically, like how to think about risk, how to think about asset allocation, that kind of thing. And so that was something that was a interesting process. It had started as an essay series I was going to run it, and a few of them are actually published. And I started outlining what I wanted it to be, and that outline turned into a table of contents. And so that has been a wonderful process. It's this creative writing that has no audience right now. I don't know who the audience will be, but yes, still in the process of that. But basically, got a lot of it researched. There was about 2 months of just solid research and reading other books. And so that extended a lot of it. And then leading to where I officially call the sabbatical over was I was catching up with an old friend that I worked with at my very first startup over 10 years ago. And a very interesting situation emerged. So I'm working in AI applied to a very unsexy industry, and it's the messy real world and gives a lot of affordance both to build better software, but also to rethink how the software is built and maintained and what it even can do.
Man, there's so many different threads I can pull here,
Pull them.
prioritizing. So one, the book I think is a great idea because for tech, most people that work in tech, they're very concentrated. And a lot of what you read on the internet doesn't apply to that works in tech,
Mhm,
especially with the unlimited upside for someone that gets really lucky, whether they start a company or they work at one. So I think that's a great idea. And it also makes sense why you stopped writing about a lot of the finance investing stuff
mhm.
because you're writing a book. I am very curious, and we can put this in the parking lot about. I similarly to you have a theory that everything you read says, well, if you look at the past, it always goes up. So because of that, it will continue happening in the future. But in today's world, it's changing so quickly and
Mhm.
so differently, especially globally, that I always wonder if that's going to be held true. So that's like one thought. But the follow-up question I have is if you didn't commit to a company, would you have still been on your sabbatical or would you have in your head, ended the sabbatical and continued working on like creative projects?
I was ready to both have a quest
Got it.
and to be working with others. One of the outcomes of my proto company that I could not build internal commitment to was it felt very lonely. And I solved a lot of the obvious things. Like I got an office with friends near me. So I had social connection and I wasn't like hermit mode. But at the same time, it is fun to build something with other people. And I think like
Yes.
that, it's like the difference of dancing alone versus dancing with others. And fundamentally,
Yes.
it's just a different thing. And so I started realizing that whatever I needed to metabolize through the sabbatical had been metabolized and that I was ready for my next thing.
Yeah. Not gonna lie, I thought I would never start a company, but it's creeping back in. Like starting to think about it. I'm not at the place where I'm thinking of ideas yet, but I'm like, yeah, that was a lot of fun building something with a group of people and tackling problems. It is fun. It's stressful, but I think if you approach it with a different mindset and you appreciate it, I think it could be a lot of fun for sure.
Yeah, a model I've been playing with recently is thinking about what you do in life as your art project.
Yeah, I
And
love that.
in many ways, a startup is this, it's the arts of enacting, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
not like painting or something like that, but in the direction of performance art or something like that. For certain people, I think you and I, the excitement of the infinite unknown is just like that
Oh,
just sings
the
to our
best.
soul, right? And
Yeah.
so, um, yeah, and for other people, like that's terrifying, and they don't want that, and they want they want to be on land, and so I think just like finding those internal resonances and not fighting them because they
Yeah.
exist.
I think the not fighting it is like the big insight. You're hardwired a certain way. Maybe through different stages of life, it might diminish or increase, but it's always going to be part of your DNA. And fighting it is just a losing battle. But it seems like the through line is just chasing your curiosity. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about is how do you cultivate that as an adult? Why do you think it's so important to cultivate curiosity and learning as an adult?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that it's not just post school. Like, if you've spent time around small children, they have it, and then it kind of,
Yes.
like, gets beat out of them,
Yeah.
where the best students are those that can work within the system that exists, and over time, they ideally open back up to this curiosity. I think humans are, by default, curious creatures because we are adaptable in the way that no other species is. And so that is both a threat to us and a feature that in any environment we can adapt to it and we can build abstractions and primitives on top of each other. Like we can create a pattern and then treat that pattern as something that's very real, like money or countries or something like that, and then build on top of it and never actually be constrained by what is like, quote, real and what is not real. And so I think that is our natural way. I almost every child I spend any time with, that is their natural way. And they want to know why the world works the way it does and how it works the way it does. I think the danger is that it's also easily hacked. So that
Yeah.
if, like in a caveman world, being infinitely curious is almost just a feature. Like it has minimal downside because we also have a fear response. If like you see something burning off in the distance, like you might, stand your ground a little bit, but you want to understand what that is, how you might be able to manipulate it, anything like that. Whereas now we can actually directly trigger that interesting circuit. And I think our culture has a bit of an immune response to other like direct triggering. So like dopamine, just triggering dopamine by itself, with like, drugs or something like that. We have this immune response like, oh, that's bad. We should not do that for reasons that most people haven't really thought about. Like, why is, flooding your dopamine system bad? But we don't really have an immune response to triggering people's like interesting detector,
Mhm.
probably because there's no like hormone tied to it, but it's real. You create something that draws your attention and people want to look at it. And so I think that is the downside of it. You asked why it's important. I would say now more than ever, the world is addictive. The things that were true a decade ago may not be true in the next decade. And if we are responsive to our environment, we're engaged in this agent arena relationship where there is no immediate separation of what we want versus what the context wants. It's both together. And I think that's critically important. People talk about the most under measured thing right now is agency. And like people don't have
Yeah.
agency. They want to be told what to do or be told how something is. And I think this is just a component of that, of like curiosity is what allows us to do precognition or postcognition and not be limited by existing frameworks. Like our left brain is fantastic at identifying a framework, what is the system, what is the structure, that kind of thing. When that breaks, I think we've basically atrophied. And so like that's why I think it's important that propagates not in a theoretical sense, but in startup decision making and deciding how you want to be in your life, career path, anything like that. Actually being able to be attuned to, oh, that is interesting for like this deeper reason and be able to like pull those threads and see what comes and be able to let go of them and that kind of thing is pretty powerful.
You mentioned like curiosity as a very essential path to wisdom,
Hmm.
and that wisdom is the best predictor of life's satisfaction. So, I guess for you, what's the difference between like curiosity as a skill and simply just consuming more information or passively consuming more information?
So I do have a model, but I think going back to the kid analogy, if you look at what childhood curiosity is, it's actually not passive consumption. It's actually this engagement with, okay, how does my being in the world relate to this external phenomenon that I'm working within? So like infants will often knock over their bottle and then, the adults react and like, quickly set it up or something like that. And interesting, knock over the bottle again
Yeah.
and like maybe throw it this time, like actually like push and prod. And so I see curiosity as fundamentally relational. So it's not just information, it's not the propositional knowledge, it's not just facts. It is a way to actually transform yourself to be able to engage with reality and whatever reality that you're interested in, whether it's, in the startup world or philosophy or anything like that. And so I think that is one of the things that's broken with a lot of like information consumption is that people think that if I just consume the right facts, I'll be able to make the right decisions. And that only works if you're able to fully metabolize them and have
Yeah.
them change you and wrestle with them and see like, why are they right? Why are they wrong? in what context does this apply? In what context does it not apply? And so I think that's the root of curiosity that excites me, and that is radically different from any kind of just like, here's the best news feed with the best articles and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you have like an example during your sabbatical where you pulled a thread and you just kept pulling and you kind of followed what you found interesting, what excited you, and how it led to maybe something like magical?
One thread that I pulled that maybe a little bit magic, but was this exploration into the placebo effect. I was trying to answer a question for myself of what's going on. On one hand, you see the placebo effect is real, that it is like this mind over matter, that if you just believe you can cure your cancer or something in that direction. And then you also see people that are like, no, the placebo effect is just to capture basically the statistical variation of that population being studied. There's nothing going on. There is no mind over matter, that. And so that was the beginning of the thread I wanted to pull. And as I pulled it, I recognized that I think people are talking about different things when they talk about the placebo
Hmm.
effect, and that some of them are quite useful to understand in their own merits. Almost like we need four different phrases for these things that we want to be able to point at. And being able to do that, I think in many ways loosened my model of what counts as real, particularly in the context of like what is useful, and not making any necessarily like metaphysical claims or anything like, but more of on the lines of how can we actually magnify this to the largest amount possible. And
Yeah.
so that took me in many different locations. Like one of them was I studied what I could get my hands on ancient shamanic medicine, of like, okay, you have no targeted interventions at all. What do you do? And so things like changing someone's subjective experience of their ailment is actually useful. Like letting them feel calm, feeling like it's being taken care of or something like that is useful. Occasionally you stumble upon a plant that has a compound in it that'll do the thing you want it to do. But all of those in your mind as a shaman is all the same thing. It's all
Yeah.
like, we're going to create this entirely inactive, dynamic experience that basically maximizes healing and the perception of healing, because the perception really matters. And so that was an interesting thread to pull on. And like it turns out that like shamanic medicine like works decently well, like, like
Yeah.
better than doing nothing, not as good in like cancer treatment, but like if you don't have chemotherapy and you don't have targeted drugs, it's actually pretty good.
Wow.
And so, like, I think that was something that it started with really just a question of like, I don't quite understand this whole placebo effect thing. And then yields into like these new models that I think are really useful. And some of the actual practical use is, so one of the most controversial figures in the world of back pain is Dr. Sarno, who
Yeah.
wrote a book about healing back pain. And it's basically making the argument that a lot of chronic pain is downstream of basically emotional dysregulation. And once you understand that and understand that the pain is actually not a signal of new damage happening, you actually can just like loosen that and let go of it. And is that all back pain? Absolutely not. Like, that there's plenty of back pain that isn't solved by this. However, I personally know of well over a dozen people that their chronic multi-year back pain was solved by this model. And so, like, is that quote the placebo effect? I don't know. Like, I don't really know what we're aiming at anymore, but it is this relationship between mind and body that addressing it just on the body side with like surgery or painkillers is really just a band-aid. And the actual problem is a lot more holistic. And so I
Yeah.
think it's ends up being very actionable once you pull a lot of threads, not really knowing where it's going to go.
You follow your curiosity, you wrestle with those ideas. Some of those could change your day to day or turn into an
Mhm.
essay. How does that apply outside of that? I know that you've talked a lot about like unstructured learning which is kind of an example of this, taking unexpected paths. Can you walk through like some examples that you found of inventors or entrepreneurs that kind of went down an unexpected path and just had like massive breakthroughs through some type of innovative product? Or I guess what I'm asking is, people might think that this invention happened and it was very linear, but in reality, it
Mhm.
was actually the opposite.
Yeah. So this pulls from a book called "Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned," and it was written by machine learning researchers who recognized this pattern in machine learning. And I think it was just one of those curiosity things that they
Yeah.
started pulling. And so this idea that a lot of our major innovations are actually not incremental. So if you think of like science as like a PhD is often taking like the sphere of knowledge and slightly expanding it, or maybe like in the, like a little
Yeah.
corner of it, a little bit. But if you look at like major innovations, whether it's like the like steam engine or like big theories like Einstein's two theories of relativity, they didn't actually come from incremental style thinking. And so the way you would get to them is actually not solvable incrementally because it requires a completely different like paradigm. So there's an author, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and basically says like science continues until there is a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift happens when the old model is now untenable and people are like holding on to this old model. So I think like the classic example of that is the heliocentric model of the universe, where the Earth is in the center of the solar
Yeah.
system, and if you track the planets, if you're really bad at tracking them, it seems like they're going around us. If you're slightly better, you realize like Mars goes backwards, so it goes across and then goes backwards. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And so they started creating like epicycles and that kind of thing to make it more and more complex inside of a system that was fundamentally broken. But even things like, the adventure of, Nerf or in Super Soaker was a guy that tinkered and was a NASA engineer. And so I think many of the major, like, areas of greatness that are outside of what, can be accomplished incrementally happen because someone was just going off the trail and then happens to find something interesting, whether it's, startup ideas or scientific theories or something like that. And I think it's important even within a company. So at levels, everyone in leadership would take think weeks. It's a week where you are working, but fully unplugged, no email, no communication with other employees, to think holistically and deeply. And I'd always start with a day long hike to clear everything of like, what are the big problems we need to solve? What are the non incremental things that will actually impact meaningful change down the road? I think it's a pretty useful model almost at every scale of society.
Reminds me like YouTube came from a dating site, Slack came from a failed game.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's not every company. I mean, like sometimes you're able to predict the future forward like 2 years in a way that no one does, and you just go straight
yeah.
to it. But often it's there is a iteration. I mean, even like the big successes of like Uber, Uber was black car. The way they thought about it was not this peer-to-peer revolution that was happening. Only in retrospect, in the 2010s, we realized that we can trust other like strangers
Yeah.
and that it's not a big deal. And so I think openness to that gives you this meta awareness that can be pretty useful later on.
If you had to give someone a framework to follow their curiosity or to cultivate their cognitive ability, like what would you kind of hand them to get started?
Figure out what's interesting to you and just follow it. I think trying to force it doesn't work. And because everyone is different, you can't just follow the path that someone else took. Like, by definition, if you're like, oh, that person's really figured it out, I should just do the exact same thing that they did. You really can't diverge away from what they're doing in any way.
Got it. Yeah, I totally agree with you. One thing I wanted to pick your brain on, Andrew, was the how and the actual tactics. And I know you have like a set of things that you do. Like you mentioned, like 10 steps. One of the steps was curating your information. So I was curious about how you actually do that, especially in the age of algorithms where everything is like kind of fed to you in feeds?
Yeah. I'll launch off the algorithm sort of thing. So I think the bull case for algorithms is give people what they want,
Yeah.
and getting people to actually fine tune their subscriptions or something like that is a big ask. People want to be passive consumers. And so observe their behavior and give them more of that. And I think it's wrong for a couple things. So one is it sets you on a very fixed path. Once you are a liberal in San Francisco that consumes certain type of content, that's all you get. Or
Yeah.
you're a conservative in Kansas, that's all you get. And I think people are wised up to the problem there without any traction of what might be the solution. The other problem is that fundamentally social networks are optimized to make money. Like, they want to increase engagement. And I would say like my ideal social network experience is where every time I partake, it is a delightful experience where I connect to other people and it's like time bound. And then I feel happy leaving,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And that will never make Facebook or Google or Twitter a lot of money. It's just not a good business model there. And so I largely think of algorithms as adversarial to your own desire, and that you should just be clear about what you want, and that consuming content is not bad, but that don't do it passively, because then you're not the one in control. You don't get to steer. You don't get to decide exactly what you're consuming and things like that. And so every platform is slightly different in the way I would approach it. I am very much an information maximalist. I consume a ton of information, but I try to be pretty careful about where it's coming from and what it does for me. So, for example, I listen to almost no very long form podcasts. So, like Trump was on Rogan
Yeah.
and my friends were talking about it. I have, like, it's not going to change any opinion of, either individual that I have.
Yeah.
And in many ways, like, if you're willing to invest that kind of time into, perhaps someone's like really smart and comes on, often they have lectures online or a book, and it's far more curated than just a random person just like spitfiring questions. And so it's not that podcasts are bad in any way. It's that the incentive of the podcast is go like 3 hours. I'm talking about like these like very large kind of podcasts. Another one is news. My co-founder, the CEO of Level, Sam Corcus, challenged me to go a month without consuming the news and keep a list of the things that I missed out on that I wish I was a part of. Cool. Like, like I want to be informed. I want to be a good citizen or something like that. At the end of the month, my list was empty because I'll passively just hear about things like there
Yeah.
was an earthquake or, like I'm not ignorant, but I just realized my compulsion of opening a new tab and typing in NPR or something like that actually wasn't serving me, that I was consuming an informational entertainment product that felt like it's important and was including me and making me a better citizen and that kind of thing. And so I think pushing away certain things intentionally can be beneficial and important. And this isn't saying entertainment is bad. I think it's more of let's be intentional about when we want to be entertained and when we think we're doing some kind of service for the world of civic engagement or, something like that. And so that's a good component. Keeping an eye on how you feel emotionally. My experience with TikTok is TikTok launched in the US and I installed the app and I lost the next 30 minutes. It just completely hacked my brain. And I realized like, oh, this is bad. They figured me out. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, the people in front of slot machines, it's like, I don't want that. I don't like the feelings of feeling emotionally manipulated for all these really important causes. I would rather engage with ideas on their merit versus just being pulled in so many different directions. And so that was really important for me. So like, for example, on Twitter, which I adore Twitter, but I mute a couple hundred words. And so my feed ends up being steered away from things that might be otherwise emotionally manipulative. But I also almost exclusively use Twitter lists. So instead of letting For You dictate what might be interesting to me, I have different pods of people that represent different things for me. So I have one of tech founders that I like reading what they tweet about. I have one for people that like to nerd out about meaning and about connection. It allows me to actually be pretty particular and also allows me to catch up. There's a couple of the Twitter lists that I like to read basically everything that gets posted. And the idea that you could like catch up on Twitter is kind of nonsensical. But if you're able to scope it down to the 15 people that if they have something to say, I want to be able to consume it, that's awesome. I'll pause because I can basically go to like every social network and like how I beat the algorithm.
Yeah. Some of the tactics I know you mentioned is like cultivating your information diet, curating your curators, consuming content that's hard to produce, like opting more for a book versus like a TikTok short, creating a landing page for everything important, whether it's on Twitter or TikTok. And then I know you mentioned on YouTube, you downloaded a Chrome extension that basically blocks the home feed and pushes you straight to your subscribe feed. So I've started to implement a lot of those things, and it's really, really helpful to curate your own fire hose of
Mhm.
information that you find interesting, that is high quality versus what the algorithm would find interesting. It's been very enriching and a good fire hose of ideas and different perspectives that doesn't feel like junk food in some
Yeah.
ways.
I think it's easier to make good decisions when you think about it in terms of information sources versus just the information itself. Because my lizard brain works the same as everyone
Yeah.
else's. If you have something that's clickbaity, I'm not immune to it. And so the way I think about it is avoid those to begin with. And so like there's a number of writers that I read almost everything that they write because I like the way they curate ideas that they're wrestling with. Sometimes it's just links. And so, I mean, there's people that have link blogs that share interesting links and they've been running for decades. And so it's, I think if you're intentional about that, you can benefit from a slower paced internet and an internet that feels less ephemeral. As an experiment once, I was hacking around the Blue Sky API, which is a Twitter rival, and I gave myself a feed that was a week delayed. And I was thinking, like, how interesting is this? And it didn't feel interesting at all. And it goes, oh, that means everything that I'm reading has this aspect of ephemerality about it that it's actually only relevant for the week.
Yeah.
And I've seen people do that similarly with news, where you consume news like a month delayed and it all looks stupid. Like, it's all, like if I give you the headlines from last month, you're gonna be like, okay, whatever. Like that didn't turn out to be anything or
Yeah.
anything like that. And so I think it's just like that metacognition of like, what do I care to be ephemeral? And what do I want to make sure that it doesn't matter if this was written today or a year ago or 10 years ago or 100 years ago, it's still as impactful to me.
Yeah. And I noticed the key is like, the internet in the 2000s was you just subscribe to as many blogs as possible. And it felt like your inbox where
Hmm.
there would just be hundreds and thousands of posts and it would feel overwhelming. Like what I've done with podcasts or YouTube or like for my RSS feed now, it's like less than 10. So it's a very small list. So when they do pop up, I'm like super excited. And I don't feel like guilty for removing someone. Maybe I was interested in that topic at
Yeah.
one point of time. I'm not anymore. I don't read anything they write, so I'll just delete it and I'll constantly kind of curate that short list, which I found helpful. You mentioned like you get really excited, you read all of those things. What were some examples of, I guess, creators or curators that you love following?
Yeah. So one that I was talking with a friend yesterday about is I think one of the people doing the best business thought right
Yeah.
now is Cedric Chin at Common Cog. And he'll deep dive into themes and you're basically just a participant on the roller coaster with him. But he has thought deeply about business strategy, about tacit knowledge and how like excellence actually happens. And he comes from like an outsider's perspective, which was useful to someone like me that thinks that I can just brute force by first principles, a
Yeah.
lot of kind of like startup-y sort of things. And it turns out like we actually do have wisdom of how do experts learn in ill-defined domains and
Yeah.
things like that. So I would highly recommend Cedric Chen. And then there's just a ton of Substacks where I think
Yeah.
Substack, I guess, created an industry where people can be writers again. And I think it's objectively worse than just blogs. but it works. It's getting people to actually like write. And so like one of my favorite Substacks is Experimental History. He is on an undertaking to basically rebootstrap science and is from academia, but has basically ejected and writes about everything from meaning to what is psychology and how are we going to have breakthroughs. And so I would say, like what's useful to me is probably different than other people, but just like paying attention to the actual sources, you're like, oh, this is really interesting. Or someone makes an amazing YouTube video, go check out that channel. It blows my mind when I find a channel that has like 1,000 subscribers and has like a video with 1 million views.
Yeah.
It's like, how did only 0.1% of
Yeah.
people end up flowing in to be like, I want more of whatever this person
Yeah.
produces?
One thing I wanted to ask you about was how you synthesize and go deeper. I know you use
Mhm.
Tana or Tana. uh,
I say Tana.
So when you read something that you find interesting, how do you synthesize it and how do you connect it to other concepts or ideas that you're wrestling with to cultivate your own independent opinions on it?
Yeah. So I think incredibly highly of a product called Readwise, and they have basically two products. One is a highlighting tool, and I'm not a highlighter. The other one is basically a reboot of what RSS readers could have been if someone had taken it seriously. And so think about it in terms of it is something that stores all of your important essays offline. So I can just like very easily pull them up on my phone with minimal connection or something like that. It has integration with AI tools and that kind of thing. I'll very permissive or very aggressively f- throw things into Readwise. And then when I want to consume, that is the place I go. I'm basically pulling from there. And they let you do these saved searches. I have a saved search of my favorite authors. And so it's probably like 20 different bloggers and Substacks. So if I throw anything to Readwise, that will be in that saved search. I have one for quick reads. Like let's say I have 10 minutes or something like I have one for long reads. And so you can kind of structure like what are the different kinds of categories of content that I want. And largely, I don't worry about mapping ideas immediately onto a note taking system. I think I want to play with ideas and see where it emerges. And when there's a theme that becomes interesting to me, I create a landing page in Tana for that. I'll create like, let's, there's some kind of metaphor or framework or some idea that someone offers. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I'll put it in there. I don't try to solve anything about it. And because it's there, my brain knows it's there. And so it's like looking for other examples of that thing or of that anti-thing where it's like, okay, that's not actually a great model or something like that. And at that point, I'll throw them in. And what happens over time is it becomes richer and richer and richer without me trying to. So like it's not I'm trying to structure everything I read. It's more of I want to create curiosity zones that can just emerge and get cultivated over time. That's the way my brain works. Other
Yeah.
people really like the structure of like a personal Notion database where they keep track of, that kind of thing. I think I consume too many essays to like want to take notes on them or
Yeah.
anything like that. But yeah, I mean, that's my approach. It's organic.
Nice. So basically, if you find a concept and it's very interesting, you'll capture it. And then maybe over time, if you read something else that's related to that, you'll add to that and try to connect ideas. And then you'll find the connections between all these different concepts that you're noodling.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll give you an example of one. So
Sure.
I was watching John Vervaeke is a cognitive psychologist, maybe philosopher adjacent, something like that, at University of Toronto. And he has a 50-part lecture series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And it is great. I recommend it only if that sounds interesting to you. Otherwise, it's like 50 hours. But in it, he'll throw out these ideas that are almost like seeds that I want to grow in my head.
Yeah.
And like he'll put a name to something that maybe I've like marinated on before or have, thought about, but I never really had anything that was legible that I could like latch on to. And so like one of his early on in the series is the concept of psychotechnologies is like we have hardware, software technology and, machines and that kind of thing. And we also have psychological technology that gets installed. And once you have it, you can do a new thing, which is pretty amazing. I mean, like an example of psychotechnology is money. Before money,
Yeah.
all trade was hard. after money, trade becomes very easy because you have this fungible kind of token that is able to, I can transact with you without fully trusting you or without wanting anything that you're immediately offering. So, like, you only sell fish, like I'm able to transact just in that, even if I don't have something that you want other than money. And so he like mentions this and like attaches a few things on it. But I was like, oh, that's really cool. Where can I find psychotechnologies elsewhere? Like, what are the types of psychotechnologies you might want to cultivate? Creating a landing pad for that. Then you have people that aren't using the word psychotechnology, but you just encounter from conversations of like, oh, that's something that like once installed gives you an ability that you didn't have before. Cool. Let me add it. And so it increases the richness of my understanding of these ideas in a way that I think like a top down outline really couldn't.
Yeah. And where does it go from here once you start like going down these different rabbit holes?
I'm not sure. So and sometimes it turns into essays.
Yeah.
Like I have this compulsion to either formalize an idea because I want other people to share on this. Like I think this is useful, but often it's because I feel like I have the principles of some idea, like the skeleton of it, but I haven't actually fleshed it out. And I think the process for me of writing forces my brain to actually connect all the ideas and make them cohesive and also make them linear. Because in many ways, my brain is a web, and making it linear actually, in many ways, formalizes what is the actual structure of it.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's writing, and that is both publicly, some of it is just for myself, and a lot of it is in like a startup context where it's, I have this idea of how we might engage with the competitive landscape or, something like that, and doing long form writing, getting feedback from people and that kind of thing. And so that's where they end up. They often turns into conversations. So sometimes I'll send people like an export of a summary of all the ones I have, and they can just pick one. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, tell me about, this one. And, it'll turn into great conversations. But I don't know. I don't, they're not entirely cohesive. So it's not like I want this to become a book of 50 mental models to rule your life. It's more just like little serendipitous landing pads that emerged for me.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it interesting is that you don't really know where it's going to go, but being super comfortable with that unknown. Because I guess one of them could
Mhm.
lead to a new company, one led to a book that you're writing, one could just be an idea that you write an essay on that you share with the world that changes someone's perspective about a topic or a concept. So I think we're just so hardwired to have a plan and to have everything being like a step by step process. But I think it's also about being really comfortable with going down like a messier process with no clear
Mhm.
direction and just kind of seeing where it goes. But using your curiosity and what excites you and what you find interesting as a compass and just trust that it might not lead to anywhere, but maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 50 leads to something really interesting that could be a
Ye
company or whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, each person doesn't need that many great ideas. For a company, it's maybe one or an insight into one or
Yeah.
something like that. But even if you think of thinkers that you deeply respect what they've accomplished,
Yeah.
it's often a few ideas. Like, it's not the prolific person that has 100 mental models or something like that. And so I think cultivating these over a long period of time can be helpful because you never know what will turn into useful personally or how it might emerge. Now is an amazing time because if you tried to take this path in history, certain ages of history, it would kind of be a non-starter. I think the world is actually very receptive to agency and someone who is curious that has this new perspective. 100 years ago, you were kind of locked into the system that you had. And not that curiosity wasn't fulfilling or something like that, but in many ways, the economic interests of the world are aligned now in a way that they weren't in previous
Yeah.
times.
What career advice would you give for young high performers that wanted to cultivate curiosity or agency or trying to find the thing that they want to work on? Like, what advice would you give someone?
Yeah. Well, I find advice interesting in general because it is there's such a small sample size. Like everyone, someone who's like successful maybe had like one hit
Yeah.
and who knows how much of that was luck or
Yeah.
something like that. And there's like legendary successful people that had three or four,
Yeah.
and how many companies have they worked in? How many teams have they worked in? It's a very small sample size. So I think the way people should receive any kind of direction that way is basically just a sample, like, and
Yeah.
basically be able to like take the gestalt of all of it. And so mine is basically you're not going to get agency from school or anything like that, but it's going to come from within an anti-school or anything like that. But that you have to be able to figure out what interests you in a way that drives you towards things that you feel actually matter. And so that's hard for a lot of people. And I don't think that everyone can actually make that leap very effectively, but it's, being very receptive. At the same time, going deep. Like, I think that there's this, I've talked to a number of younger people that are like, I never want to go into corporate culture and I want to be a generalist and, like the responsive to the world kind of thing. And I worked at Google. It was probably the best thing that happened to my career. So, like, sample size one for me, just corporate life is not all that bad. There's a lot to learn about incentive structures and how very large companies are run, and what it's like in that environment. At the same time, I think like competence in deep areas is important. Like, if you want to do something that is differentiated against everyone else, actually being able to have hardcore competence in what that thing is incredibly useful. And so like that basically like the idea that you can just be a generalist and like synthesize and strategy and something like that, I think that emerges after you've really wrestled with competence and the deep dives. And so I would say like that is high level, and then foster agency in whatever way you can. I think there's this model people have that like you are subject to your job or something like that. When in many ways you're in relationship with your job, right? And everything is made up. Like jobs are made up, titles are made up, everything's made up. And one of the best software engineers I ever worked with was an intern who didn't quite know that hierarchy is made up, and or maybe he fully knew hierarchy is made up and would just get stuff done and was like incredibly agentic. And I think like that is what is lacking of people that are, they see the obvious thing and they think someone else will do it, or it's not my concern, or something like that. And I think just getting in the mindset of like, no, like, that will actually be the differentiator in this AI world where writing code becomes easy and writing essays becomes easy. I think actually being able to sit back and, okay, what is taking in the full context in a way that no AI right now can take in? What needs to get done? Like, what
Yeah.
what is the blocker here? What would success look like working backwards from there? I don't think it's a framework. I think it's really just experimenting with what is effective. It's very interpersonal. It's very engaging with others and getting them on your side and that kind of thing.
No, I think that's great. I think the combination of agency and being competent in one or more areas is essential. I would also add pairing competence with being able to build something or create
Mhm.
something, whether it's a piece of content or a piece of software or knowing how to build a house, but having the skills to take an idea and make it happen, I think is
Mhm.
extremely critical, extremely important as well.
And part of that is you learn that by doing it. My growing my dad demonstrated this. He was a management consultant who would do electrical work and plumbing in the house. And so I never had this model that we couldn't do something. Like it's one of those things like something's broken. Okay, let's figure out how to do it. And he didn't have the internet. And so I think that just being open to figuring it out can be useful. And over time, you get good at figuring it out. And
Uh,
I'm sure if you've ever spent any time with a farmer, They have to. You can't just like
Yeah,
outsource and hire every time something breaks.
exactly.
And so they have this intuitive mental model of how their machinery works, what certain sounds are, or someone is really into car mechanics and collecting cars and working on them themselves. You end up with this underlying intuition of how things underlying work. I think the only way you do that is be willing to fail.
Yeah, 100% agree. Well, I really appreciate your time. I love that we got to talk about your sabbatical, curiosity, following unexpected paths, your process for going down rabbit holes and synthesizing, wrestling with ideas. And I love how we were able to tie that into advice for younger people. So I really appreciate your time. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad we finally got to connect because I've been following your work and reading all your essays for such a long time. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Likewise, no, I very much appreciate it.